Hello, everybody. Hope you're doing well. Hope you're enjoying your summer. It's flying by. Poindexter family are a baseball family. I have a 13-year-old and a 16-year-old. Both play travel baseball, so we spend most of our summer on the ball field. A lot of time. Love it, but I do hope at some point to return to civilian life. And one of the things that I sort of dream about someday is having a tightly landscaped yard. I love a good landscaping job. Um, Go for a walk every morning and listen to Apple News. And one of my favorite activities during that walk is to just look at the neighborhood and see the yards where people pour a lot of time in to define the edges. Like I love a good clean line on a mulch bed where the mulch ends and the grass begins. I love edging on a sidewalk, to stare down a sidewalk and see that really pronounced groove, and then the grass that extends in a straight line upward. Just looks really nice. It brings kind of like peace. You appreciate that it's been taken care of. It brings a sense of order in a chaotic world, and my yard, as my neighbors would attest, is far from that these days, but who knows? Maybe someday. Funny thing about landscaping too is that it requires constant oversight, because if you let it go too long, that groove, that well-defined edge on the sidewalk, well, the mud will and dirt will seep over and creep onto the sidewalk, and then the grass starts to grow on top of that. And if left go long enough, you can have a situation where the whole sidewalk is covered over and forgotten about. So let's just get that idea kind of simmering, and we'll get back to that idea of tight landscaping in a little bit. But what I want you to just remember is kind of the sense of order that a well-maintained yard, the clearly defined edges and boundaries of tight landscaping can bring to a house or to a neighborhood or to the observer. Like there's a sense of order that brings. So we're going to get that simmering, and I'm going to move on to the next thought, and we'll get back to that in a little bit. We've been walking through the life of Peter, one of the disciples, a leader in the early church. We've talked about his spiritual failures and triumph in this series called Foundations, and said that not only do we see the example of his life, but he also wrote a couple letters in the Bible, 1st and 2nd Peter, to early Christians, and we've been walking through some of that. So I'm going to read to you from one of those letters. I'm going to start with 1 Peter 2, 11 and 12, and we'll get going on our next thought for the morning, or afternoon, or whenever you happen to be watching this. So here we go. Dear friends, I urge you as foreigners and exiles to abstain from sinful desires, which wage war against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans, that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. So Peter gets very practical as he fleshes out the implications for these two sentences a little bit later in the verse. But what I want to do is look at the overall concept of this instruction. Okay? So Peter says, if you follow Jesus, you should always have two things in the back of your mind as you live. First, you will stand before Jesus one day. He talks about on the day he visits us. So the ancient Christians were fueled by the hope that Jesus would return and end this phase of the world and usher in something new and something redeemed. And so always have that in mind, that we're all going to stand before Jesus when he visits us. But also a second thing is we should remember that people who are not familiar with Jesus on a personal level are always watching to see us and how meaningful our faith is to us. They're always watching. And if you want people to know Jesus the way you do, we better be sure to demonstrate that our faith matters to us. So he says that they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. So, he says that we should be living such good lives among the pagans. Now, this was his way of saying people who don't know Jesus personally like we do. Live such good lives among the pagans that they would be inspired by your life. He wants people to understand the goodness and love of Jesus just by looking at your life or at my life. So if you follow Jesus, Peter says that your life should look differently from those around you in a desirable way, like in a good way, that influences, in a way that influences their personal decisions and receptivity to the hope that you found in Jesus. So your life should influence them positively, should push them toward Jesus. They should want what you have. So good question to ask yourself. Does your life's example cause people to notice a difference? That's kind of a scary question. It's a unnerving question. Does your life cause people to notice a difference between the way you live and the way everybody else lives? Does your expression of your own faith bring people closer to Jesus or push people away from Jesus? Those are humbling questions to wrestle with. So now let that thought marinate. So we got the landscaping thing simmering, and then we're going to let that lifestyle choice thought marinate, and we'll get back to that as we cook up something in this teaching. I'm going to read you from Genesis 1. Let's take a minute to look at the creation story. I've shortened this up a little bit for time's sake, but these are the first words in the Bible. Remember the role that this would have played. Like our modern Western, we tend to want to look at it scientifically, like for the origin of species and stuff, but in the ancient world, they weren't concerned about all that. They wanted to know what God was like, what humans were supposed to be like. The ancient tribes gained their identity and their worldview from their creation stories, because a lot of the tribes had their own creation stories in various religions and people groups. This was the ancient Hebrew or Israelite creation story. Let's look at some of the concepts that were baked into this story that God wanted ancient people to operate around. Ideas about God, ideas about the world, ideas about what it means to be human. Okay, so I'm going to start in the very beginning here. It says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. So there's an earth, but it's formless, and there is darkness and waters. This was ancient language that communicated a state of chaos. You might say, now the earth had no boundaries or edges within. So get that imagery in your head. It's a boundaryless, edgeless earth. It's chaos. And God said, let there be light. And there was light. And God saw that the light was good. And God separated light from darkness. God separated out light from darkness. The word separated says that God gets his creative work, he gets to his creative work by separating things out. He creates boundaries or edges for dark and light. So he starts his creative work by creating boundaries and edges, by separating things. Verse 6, and God said, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it be separated, waters from waters. And God made the expanse and separated the waters that were under the expanse from the waters that were above. Basically what God is doing is he's creating a sky. Now instead of a big water blob, now there's sky and there's water. So we see the word separated appear again. God separates air from water so that there's now sky and water, and God continues his work by establishing boundaries and edges. Very important theme in this creation story. Now, we also see, if you want to read on your own in Genesis 1, that days are starting to happen. There is evening and there's morning. There's days. So time has also been separated and given limits and boundaries. And then in verse 9 we see, And God said, let the waters under the heavens be gathered together in one place, and let dry ground appear. And it was so, and God called the dry land earth, and the waters were gathered together, and he called those seas, and he saw that it was good. So God continues his creative work. See the theme here in this story? It doesn't just come right out and say, you have to pick it up. That's the way the Bible works. You have to kind of breathe it in and do the mental work. But his creative work it starts with chaos, and it gives edges to the water and land. Rather than separated, things were gathered in that verse that we just read, but it's the same idea. More edges, more boundaries. So now there's light and darkness. They have boundaries. Sky and physical material have boundaries and edges. It starts with chaos, and God creates edges, and there's light, and there's darkness, there's sky, there's physical matter, there's land, there's water. God's on a roll creating boundaries and edges from chaos. Verse 11, and God said, let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees bearing fruit, in which is their seed, according to its kind, on the earth. And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed according to their own kinds, and trees bearing fruit, in which is their seed, according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. So next, God creates vegetation, but he gives them boundaries. They can only create their own kind. A banana tree can't just go creating fruit all willy-nilly. It can only create bananas. There are limits, there are edges, there are boundaries, there is order. Now I'll stop there and let you read Genesis 1 this week for maybe some other ways that God creates edges and boundaries. It's a huge theme in Genesis 1. What I want us to do now is to think about ancient man just trying to figure out the basics of the world. Just trying to figure out what it means to be human and what God is like and what this is all about. I think one of the major themes that you get from this story, this creation story given to humans from God, was that he is a God who values boundaries, edges, and order. There's some tight landscaping relative to the chaos that could exist in creation as God does his creative work. Have you ever thought about that? A long time later, God's people, the Israelites, were freed from over 400 years of slavery in Egypt. And they didn't know what it meant to be a people of God. God gives them instructions to get them going. They didn't know how to order their life. They were just slaves. They didn't know how to have freedom. Most of the rules that God gave them would be sort of, I guess you'd say, overturned or released by Jesus in the new movement he came to start with. But the Bible says that those times and laws were fulfilled eventually through Jesus. But before that, they were rules of order for the Israelites as they were released from slavery. They were given to the Israelites to help them thrive. So let's take a look at a few of them. Leviticus 10:10, and there are like 600 of these things, okay? Leviticus 10:10. You are to distinguish between the holy and the common, and between the unclean and the clean. Leviticus 19:19. You shall keep my statutes. You shall not let your cattle breed with a different kind. You shall not sow your field with two kinds of seed. You shall, nor shall you wear a garment of cloth made of two kinds of material. So you can't go mixing things together. Learn to separate. Learn to have boundaries and edges in the way you think, in the way you act, in the way you farm, in the way you dress. Boundaries and edges. There's another neat little verse in Proverbs 22:28. Do not move the ancient landmark or boundary stone that your fathers have set. Now don't get caught up in these rules themselves, but think rather about the spirit of this new community of people that God released from slavery. He did so with boundaries and edges in mind. Even when it came to your property, you weren't supposed to blur the line of what was yours and what was your neighbor's. There were clear boundaries and clear edges. This is important to God. So let's put this all together. God's creation looks and functions best when there are clear edges and boundaries. Just like the sidewalk looks best with defined and well-maintained edges and boundaries, Peter says our lives should be admirable to onlookers. How are we to best implement Peter's command? I think it's by examining our life edges and boundaries. There should be some kind of order to our lives. Our morality, our life choices, there should be clearly defined edges noticeable to all. Easier said than done. People are looking, just like when we're out for a walk and we notice homes with clear lines and edges and landscaping in their yards. People are looking at your life for a different kind of way to live. There should be an order in the midst of the chaos in your life. You should stand out. The edges in your life should stand out. This should catch the attention to someone overwhelmed by the chaos. It should draw them in to your lifestyle. People who realize their lives are without order should look longingly at the structure, moral structure, wisdom structure of your life and want something similar in theirs. Now, one more general thought, and then we'll talk about just some practical things, just kind of get you going, get you thinking about really applying this, okay? Notice that Peter doesn't encourage you or I to start trying to order other people's lives. He talks about people who are far from God, and he doesn't say, go yell at them and tell them how their lives should be ordered. He says, you focus on your life. He doesn't say, go and get legislation passed that forces people to have spiritual boundaries in their life. He says, you focus on your life, on your boundaries, on your edges, on your morality, on your separation from darkness. You focus on you so that those people living however they want, those pathways apart from God, they lead to their own kind of despair. And then they look to your life. And then they are drawn in to the life that you live. So don't focus out there on what everybody else is doing, all chaotic and wrong. Instead, focus inward on your own boundaries and living with consistency. The pathway you feel is best edged out for you according to God's ways, and keep your focus there. And then, if somebody comes to you, or when someone comes to you and expresses a kind of difference and it makes sense, you can share with them what works for you, and then they'll be ready to receive it. So focus inward. All right, let's get real practical here. I'm going to give you a few ways to kind of create edges or boundaries in your life, and then you think about the problem areas of your life and sort of create edges, boundaries, policies, whatever you want to say, okay? Take these ideas and run with them and make them your own and make them better and all that, okay? So, my advice first is that you take one area at a time. Think about the areas in your life, your morality, finances, whatever, family life, marriage, that need clearly defined edges. Create that policy or edge that you want to live out, but do it one area at a time, or else you'll get overwhelmed and not implement anything. Okay, so first, let's talk about Bible. If you want to grow spiritually and maintain a good life with boundaries, you're going to have Bible reading. You just are. And so here's a groove, okay? Here's a groove for you. Here's an edge. Without Bible reading, it's going to be tough. And let's just say you have no Bible reading. I would suggest that you carve out a 15-minute time slot. Let's say from 6:45 a.m. to 7 a.m. I will read from the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, the life and teachings of Jesus. So you have that groove now, and you schedule, and you have a groove now. You have a solid, defined groove. That's where I'll read my Bible, and that's what I'll read, and I'll do it as many days as I can, as often as I can, or maybe on your drive to work. you listen to Bible on audio for 15 minutes, but you have a groove now, you have an edge, you have a boundary. You went from nothing to now you have your plan, you have some definition. I will get my Bible reading. And that not only gives you the benefit of Bible reading, the benefit of a habit, but also it's going to help you to define what's right, what's wrong, what's wise, what's foolish. And so that puts an immediate picture, that sidewalk that goes from the grass seeping over. You use that edger and create that groove, and that grass goes upward and it's all well defined. That one thing gives you a defined habit, and now you have your Bible reading. Okay, let's say that lust is a struggle for you. You really struggle with lust, you know you do. The edges have gotten all blurry with your lifestyle. You're not morally pure like you want to be. Your thought life is run amok, whatever. You might say, I need edges and boundaries in my thought life because of lust. Couple policies. Don't take your phone into a locked room. Don't have any passwords that you keep from your spouse. Define the kinds of interactions that you'll have with coworkers, particularly coworkers that you may be attracted to or that may be attracted to you. So, short conversations. I'm not going to have lunch with them. I'm going to keep conversation on a need-to-know basis so that things don't get flirty or whatever. It's going to look different for different people, but you need to come up with your own policies and boundaries for your behavior. So a clear edge or boundary could be, these are the kinds of interactions I'm going to have. I will never have these kinds of interactions. I will never go here because that person's there. I will never take my phone into a locked room, whatever. You're creating boundaries for yourself and your behavior. I do not do these actions. And that's giving you an edge to how far you'll go one way or the other. That's separating out dark from light. Let's talk about family life. Maybe you're struggling with family life, whether it be marriage or parenting or whatever. You might have to start by creating a clear edge to your workday. If you got some workaholic stuff, I'll be done working at this time every day or whenever possible. I will go home at this time, even leaving work undone. There's an edge. I won't creep past this. You may have to carve out time for intimacy with your spouse as things get busy. And it might look something as ridiculous as, we will do this many times a month or a week or whatever, to make sure that, because things start to creep and then other things start to creep in and fires start to die. And sometimes you have to just carve out, this is our path to protect our marriage. Could be with kids. I will spend this many nights at home, and I will not waver. Clearly defined edge. I will take my daughter out this many times a month. I will watch my son play Xbox this many times a week. And have your edges and boundaries that clearly define your behavior. And then you, based on whatever you struggle with, you just sit and think, how can I create boundaries and edges and then honor them? And review each night, how did I do with my boundaries and edges today? So think about the areas of your life. Be intentional about their edges and boundaries, because that's what's going to look different about your life. Because let's face it, most people don't have them. Most people do whatever they want, whenever they need to do it, however they need to get ahead or gain instant gratification or whatever it is. Most people don't create and protect boundaries, but when you do, it gets noticed. So remember, while creation was designed for boundaries and edges, and around boundaries and edges in the creation story, it doesn't get there on its own. Given enough time, your sidewalks will cover with mud and grass. It would grow over the whole thing. Bushes and shrubs would grow all the way over walkways, and trees would go out over sidewalks. You have to maintain. You have to define, and then you have to maintain your moral and spiritual boundaries and edges, just like you would with landscaping or anywhere in creation. Even though creation was designed for order, it doesn't do it on its own. It gets overgrown and it mixes quickly. It requires our intervention to protect it, to define it, and to keep it that way. So be intentional. Give it just a few months off. and the boundaries that you worked hard to create will be blurred, if not altogether gone. So I hope you'll take some time and think through the areas in your life that need help and how to create boundaries and edges, what would work to define edges, and think about the kind of vibes you're sending. Are you pushing people further away from Jesus, or would they look at a well-ordered life and think, I want that? So I hope you'll take this and do something with it. Have a good week, everybody.